The morning Willa Dane walked into the land office at Harwick, Nebraska, the clerk was eating a biscuit. He was a thin man named Alderman, with ink-stained fingers and the particular exhaustion of someone who had processed too many failures in too short a time. The drought had emptied half the claims in Custer County that summer. Every week brought another family through his door, hollow-eyed, hat in hand, asking about the 160 acres the government had promised them, the acres that had turned to cracked dirt and broken dreams. He had learned not to look up when the door opened. Whatever walked in it was usually grief wearing a different set of clothes. He looked up anyway. The woman standing in his doorway was not what he expected, though he could not have said precisely what he expected. She was 38 years old with dark brown hair pulled back without ceremony and eyes the color of a sky that hadn't decided yet whether to storm. Her dress was calico blue, once faded to something between slate and memory with careful mending at both elbows, that told him more about her than any document could. She was not tall. Her shoulders, though, were the shoulders of someone who had been carrying weight for longer than was fair, and her hands, when she set them on the counter, were the hands of a woman who had stopped being careful about her hands some time ago. Two children stood behind her. A boy of 8 with hair the color of dry wheat watching the room with the quiet attention of a child who had learned that adults did not always do what they said they would. A girl of 5 with her mother's dark hair holding something small in her fist. A fragment of broken china flowers painted blue on a ground that used to be white save from God knows what wreckage along the road that had brought them here. The woman placed 5 silver dollars on the counter. Alderman looked at the coins. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment because he was counting the dollars and hoping he had miscounted. He had not miscounted. Her name was Willa Dane, she told him. Her husband, Robert Dane, had died of typhoid in a boarding house outside Ames, Iowa the previous May. The wagon had broken an axle outside Cozad. She had sold the 2 oxen to pay for the repair. She had sold the repaired wagon 2 weeks later to buy train passage west. She had arrived in Harwick with a carpet bag containing 1 spare dress, a Bible with Robert's name written inside the front cover in his own careful hand, and 5 silver dollars that represented every cent she owned in the world. She wanted to buy the Aldrich property. Alderman set down his biscuit. The Aldrich property, what locals had taken to calling the Aldrich ruin, or sometimes just the Aldrich, the way you might refer to a scar by the name of the wound that made it, had burned in the late summer of 1884. A chimney fire, most people said, though the circumstances had never been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. What remained after the fire consumed everything burnable was a rectangle of limestone walls standing on the western edge of Harwick, like the outline of a house someone had begun to draw and then abandoned. 4 walls 2 feet thick, rising 8 feet from the packed earth floor. No roof, no door, no windows. Just stone blackened at the top where the fire had burned hottest open to the sky, slowly filling with the particular silence of abandoned places. Nobody had bought it because nobody wanted it. The lot was worth $5 on paper, maybe the way a hole in the ground is worth the dirt someone else might pay you to fill it with. Alderman told her the property was not fit for habitation. Willa Dane did not move. Her hand stayed flat on the counter beside the coins. He told her winter in Nebraska was not like winter elsewhere. He had seen what happened to people who underestimated it. He had signed the paperwork for 3 families who had not survived their first season on the plains, had watched women younger than her come through his door full of determination and leave for the churchyard before Easter. Her hand did not move. He told her the structure had no roof, no door, no stove, no water source within a quarter mile. "Is $5 enough?" she said. Alderman looked at the children. The boy had put his hand on his sister's shoulder. The girl was still holding the fragment of china, watching her mother's face, with the focused calm of a child who has learned to read weather in an adult's expression and has made peace with whatever that expression means. He reached for the deed. Later he would tell people he didn't know why he did it. The truth, if he were honest with himself, was simpler than that. There was something in the way she had not argued with a single thing. He said had not assured him she knew what she was doing, had not performed confidence she did not possess, that made him think she understood exactly what she was buying. She was not deceiving herself. She was making a choice with open eyes, and a man could respect that even when he thought the choice was wrong. He would think about that moment many times in the years that followed. The Aldrich property sat 300 yards from the nearest occupied structure, a frame house belonging to a farmer named Otto Frick, who had come to Nebraska from Pennsylvania in 1873 and had built his claim through 13 winters of the kind of work that leaves marks on a man's body that never fully heal. He was 57 years old, broad through the chest, with hands that looked like tools themselves, thick-fingered, calloused, past the point of softness, capable of tasks that required both strength and a tolerance for discomfort that most men cultivated only out of necessity. His beard had gone white sometime in his mid-40s, and he wore it trimmed close in the practical way of men who have no time for vanity. His wife Ingrid was a quiet woman 10 years younger than him, who had the particular gift of saying necessary things without raising her voice. They had two children, Carl, 6 years old, serious with his father's deliberate way of moving through the world. Marta, 4, who had not yet learned to be deliberate about anything. Frick noticed the new arrival the morning after the deed changed hands. He noticed the way a farmer notices anything that might become a problem, not with hostility, but with the careful attention of someone who understands that problems ignored tend to compound interest at a rate no one can afford. He walked over from his property the following morning, a Tuesday, when the August heat was already pressing down on the plains like a hand on the back of a neck. Willa was inside the four walls when he arrived, standing in the center of the packed earth floor, turning slowly, looking at the space with the concentrated attention of a person examining a problem they intend to solve before they understand it. Eli was picking through the rubble at the base of the north wall, pulling out anything that might be useful. A rusted hinge, a fragment of cast iron, a length of wire that had survived the fire inside a crack between stones. June sat cross-legged near the east wall, her piece of china balanced on her knee, examining it in the morning light with the seriousness of a child who has decided this object matters. Frick stopped at the opening where the door had been. He did not introduce himself. He looked at the walls. He looked at the open sky above where a roof should have been. He looked at the children, then at the woman standing in the center of it all, with her sleeves already rolled to her elbows at 7 in the morning. He told her what he knew, the way he would have told anyone, because what he knew was true, and what was true was what mattered in Nebraska. She would need 4 cords of wood minimum to survive until April. There was no timber within 15 miles of Harwick. Every tree within reach had been cut in the decades since settlement began. She had no stove, no insulation, no protection from wind. A norther could drop the temperature 40 degrees in 12 hours without advance notice. He had seen cattle freeze standing upright in their tracks. He had seen a man lose 3 fingers to frostbite in November, which was not even the dangerous month, not even close to the month that killed. He was not trying to frighten her. He was telling her what he knew because that was the only honest thing to do. "I've seen children frozen in their beds," he said, because their parents thought they could make do with less than they needed. The silence that followed was not the silence of a woman with nothing to say. It was the silence of a woman deciding precisely what to say and discarding several options before settling on the one that mattered. "Have you ever been wrong, Mr. Frick?" Her voice was level without challenge, the way a person asks a question they genuinely want answered. He looked at her for a long moment. The question sat between them in the August heat. Then he turned and walked back toward his own property without answering. He thought about that question for 3 days. In the field at the dinner table, lying awake in the dark while Ingrid slept beside him with the steady breathing of a woman at peace with where she was. He thought about it because it was a fair question, and fair questions deserve consideration, and because something in the way she had asked it without anger, without performance, as a genuine inquiry into the nature of his certainty, had lodged in a place he could not easily reach. What Willa was thinking about during those same 3 days was the wall itself. She was carrying water from the public well a quarter-mile each way twice a day, the bucket heavy enough that the bale left a red crease across her palm that did not fade between trips when she stopped to rest against the eastern face of the Aldrich ruin. The sun had been up for 4 hours. The temperature was somewhere past 90 degrees. The air above the prairie shimmered with heat that turned the horizon into something liquid and unreliable. She pressed her palm flat against the limestone. The stone was cool, not room temperature, cool, almost cold in the way of a thing that has been insulated from the day's argument by its own mass. In the middle of an August afternoon, with the sun beating directly on the exterior face of the wall, the 2-foot-thick limestone was holding the temperature of the previous night, as though the heat of the day could not penetrate deeply enough to change what the stone had already decided to be. She stood there with her hand on the wall for a long time longer than the rest required. Her grandmother in Columbus had kept a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house A low-door earth walls packed dirt floor. In summer, it stayed cool enough to keep butter solid. In winter, it stayed above freezing while everything outside turned to iron. Not warm enough to live in, but warm enough to preserve what needed preserving through the months that would otherwise destroy it. The Aldrich walls were 2 feet of limestone, dense, heavy, the same material that lay just beneath the surface all across Custer County, the rock that farmers cursed when they hit it with a breaking plow, and builders valued when they wanted something that would outlast the builder by a generation. If stone held cold by the same principle that earth held cold by mass, by insulation, by the physics of density resisting change, then it held heat by the same principle. The question was whether you could trap enough heat inside these walls to matter, whether you could cover the open top with something that would hold warm air the way the earth held it in her grandmother's root cellar, the way the ground itself held it 3 feet down where the frost never reached. Not a wooden roof. Wood was what had burned here. Wood was also what she could not get. She set the water bucket down on the dry grass. She walked back inside the 4 walls and stood in the center, turning the way she had turned on the first day, but seeing different things now. 16 feet by 20, 320 square feet of floor. If she could span the width 16 feet with a ridgepole, one heavy timber running the length of the structure from east wall to west wall. At the peak then, run rafters angling down from that ridgepole to the tops of the north and south walls, she would have a frame. Over the frame she could lay brush packed tight. Over the brush she could lay sod cut from the prairie, the same material that formed the walls of soddies all across Nebraska, thick with root mass, dense with the accumulated decades of prairie growth, heavy enough to insulate, tight enough to seal. A sod roof. Not on sod walls the way everyone else built it, but on stone. The walls that held temperature like the earth itself, covered by a layer of actual earth. The structure would function the way the ground functioned, absorbing heat from the stove, and the bodies inside releasing it slowly through the night, when the fire burned low, refusing to be hurried by what the weather was doing on the other side of the stone. She did not know if the weight would buckle the charred timber she planned to use as rafters. She did not know if the sod would seal before the first rain turned everything underneath it to mud. She did not know if any of this was anything more than a woman who had exhausted her other options, building a theory out of what she could observe and what she desperately needed to be true. But Otto Frick had laid out her death with great precision and considerable experience, and that left only the directions he had not thought to look. She picked up the water bucket. She walked back to the children. The following morning she began dragging charred timbers from the ruins of the Aldrich barn, which stood 40 yards east of the house walls, and had burned at the same time, though less completely. The fire had taken the upper portions of the beams, but left the cores intact below the char line, solid wood preserved by the very fire that had consumed its surface, the way a log burns from outside in and takes longer than you expect to become nothing. She needed a ridgepole 16 feet long and thick enough to carry weight without flexing. She needed 15 rafters, each 12 feet, each sound through their cores. The work of moving a charred timber any meaningful distance is not work that gets easier with repetition. Each beam left black along her palms, across her dress, on the ground behind her, in a dark streak that marked her progress like a record. Her shoulders began building towards something worse on the second day. By the third day, the building had become a fact she worked around rather than a condition she tried to fix. It was during the third day's hauling, when she had moved 2 beams the full distance from barn to house walls, that Nell Cutter appeared at the edge of the road. Nell Cutter lived half a mile north in a frame house that leaned slightly eastward, as if it had been listening for something coming from that direction for so long, it had simply stopped correcting for the lean. She was 46 years old, angular, dressed in the practical gray of a woman who had stopped thinking about color in favor of function. She had buried a husband and 2 children in Indiana before coming to Nebraska, and Nebraska had confirmed rather than changed her general assessment of life's reliability. She was not cruel. She was a woman who had lost enough to have no patience for pretending. She stood at the road's edge and watched Willa drag a timber that was winning the argument by considerable margin. "What in God's name are you building with burnt wood?" Willa set the timber down. Her arms had moved past, shaking into a dense heaviness that would translate to uselessness by evening. "A roof. The core is solid, only the outside burned." Nell walked closer, nudged the timber with her boot, looked at the ruin visible beyond it, looked at Willa's blackened hands. "Frick says you'll be dead by February." Mr. Frick said January, actually. Something shifted in Nell Cutter's expression, a small recalibration. The look of a person encountering data that does not fit the category they had prepared for it. She did not help with the timber. Before she left, though, she paused at the road's edge and said without looking back, "Widow Voss, 2 miles east. Lost her husband last spring. She has a plow horse she cannot afford to feed through winter. Might trade labor for use of the animal." A pause. Might not. Then she walked north toward her leaning house without another word. Bertie Voss was 70 years old, originally from Vermont, who had come west with her husband Clement in 1872, under the terms of the Homestead Act, with the particular faith of people who believed the government's promises about land were as solid as the land itself. Clement had died the previous April, a quiet death, a heart that finished its work one morning while he was checking the fence line, leaving Bertie in possession of a claim, a horse, a barn with a leaking roof, and the specific kind of solitude that comes from outliving the person whose presence made a place feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. She was bent at the spine in the way that decades of physical work bend people, but her eyes were a deep brown that cataloged everything they landed on. She did not own much that was unnecessary. She owned the land, the horse, a roan mare named Kate, steady rather than fast, with the experienced patience of an animal that has been worked hard for many years, and the knowledge of how to outlast things, which was the most practical asset anyone on the Nebraska plains possessed. Willa walked the 2 miles east on a Thursday morning and found Bertie on her porch shelling beans into a wooden bowl with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has made peace with the pace of necessary work. She explained the situation plainly without apology or softening. She needed use of Kate and the breaking plow for 3 days a week through September and into October. In exchange, she would provide 3 days of labor per week, whatever Bertie needed done. Bertie shelled beans while Willa talked. When Willa finished, Bertie set the bowl aside and studied her with those dark recording eyes. "I don't ask whether a person knows how to do a thing," Bertie said. "I ask whether they'll do it when the doing is hard and nobody's watching." "I'll do it," Willa said. Bertie stood up her spine, announcing its objections audibly. "Then start by hauling that feed sack from the barn to the bin by the east fence. After that, we'll discuss the horse." Raymond Holt arrived in the second week of September, driving a 2-horse buggy from Omaha, with the ease of a man accustomed to covering distance without personally exerting himself to do so. He was 44, clean-shaved, wearing a jacket that had not been slept in, with the particular groom quality of a man whose livelihood depends on appearing more prosperous than the people he is negotiating with. He had spent 15 years acquiring distressed properties at the bottom of their value and releasing them at the top, and he had developed in that time a reliable eye for the specific texture of a situation that was about to get worse before anyone in it would admit it. He found Willa on the roof. She was setting a slab of sod-dense, root-heavy, roughly 45 pounds of compacted prairie into position on the brush layer near the eastern edge of the frame. Her boots dark with earth, her arms running on the diminishing reserve of a morning's continuous work. She heard the buggy on the road below, looked down long enough to register a clean jacket and polished boots, then looked back at the sod, because the sod required placing before it required anything else. Holt waited with the patience of a man who has learned that waiting cost him nothing. When she came down the ladder, he introduced himself with the practiced warmth of a man who has introduced himself to desperate people so many times that the introduction has become a performance he could deliver in his sleep. He said he understood she had purchased the Aldrich property. He was prepared to offer $9 cash that afternoon, $4 above what she had paid. Willa wiped her hands on her skirt. Behind her, the ridgepole was visible above the east wall with 3 rows of sod already in place on the brush layer, the whole improbable structure of her intention right there for him to evaluate. "It's not for sale." Holt smiled the smile of a man who has heard this before from people who later change their mind. He told her he meant no disrespect. He had seen a great many projects like this one, undertaken by people in circumstances like hers. The mathematics of a sod roof on stone walls this old, with winter arriving in 6 weeks, did not favor her. He was offering a rational exit before circumstances removed the option. Willa looked at him with the steadiness she had been bringing to every uncomfortable conversation since Iowa. "If I'm going to fail and freeze, why do you want it?" The smile adjusted slightly. "The walls are good limestone. Someone will want them eventually." So you're betting on my failure. I'm offering you a way out before failure becomes the only option available. He said it pleasantly, the way men say things they have rehearsed until the edges are smooth. She held his gaze the way she had held Alderman's gaze in the land office, not with anger, but with the quality of stillness that belongs to a person who has already faced the worst version of a conversation and discovered they could survive it. Then you'll wait, Mr. Holt. I believe that's something you're practiced at. His smile became something harder. He told her in the agreeable tone of a man stating an observable fact that when winter settled the matter, he would acquire the property from the county for back taxes at a figure well below his current offer, and that the only meaningful difference between the two outcomes was that she would no longer be present to witness it. Willa picked up the next slab of sod from the pile at the base of the wall. Then I suppose the difference matters considerably more to me than it does to you. She went back up the ladder. He left. She laid sod until the light gave out. The ridgepole had taken 2 days to raise, and those 2 days had taken something from her that did not entirely come back. She had found the cottonwood trunk in the creek bed 3 miles southeast, 16 feet of it, 8 inches across at the narrow end, straight enough to serve heavy in the way that only wood pulled from a wet place can be heavy, as if the water had added weight to it that the drying never fully removed. She rigged a rope harness from a salvaged bridle, attached it to Kate, and dragged the trunk back across 3 miles of late summer prairie, the wood gouging a raw channel through the grass that would remain visible until spring covered it. Getting it onto the walls required the kind of thinking that accepts difficulty as the starting condition rather than the obstacle. She built ramps at each end of the ruined piles of rubble limestone, stacked at an angle against the interior face of the east and west walls, rising from the floor to the wall top, over a horizontal distance of about 4 feet, stable enough to roll a heavy trunk up if the rolling went right. She positioned the cottonwood at the base of the east ramp, tied ropes to both ends, looped them over the top of the walls, anchored one end to Kate on the outside, and one end to a stake she had driven into the packed ground beyond the west wall. Then she pulled. Kate pulled. Eli pulled, his arms locked straight, every cord in his 8-year-old neck visible with the effort, his face carrying the expression of a child who has decided that stopping is a thing other people do. June held the guide rope around a fence post, her small body leaning back against the weight to keep the trunk from drifting sideways on the ramp. The trunk moved 8 inches. It moved a foot. Then it slipped sideways, lost the ramp, and dropped back to the earth floor with a concussion that sent a small avalanche of loose mortar down the interior face of the north wall. They reset. They pulled again. It rose 10 inches and slipped again. On the 4th attempt, Willa changed the angle of approach, tightening the guideline so that June was pressing the trunk against the ramp face rather than simply beside it. She spoke to Kate in a low voice, something between a request and a confidence, and the mare leaned into the harness with everything she had. The trunk rose. It cleared the slip point. It reached the top of the ramp, tipped over the lip of the west wall, and lay across both end walls, spanning the full 16 feet, its own weight settling it into position. Nobody moved for a full 10 seconds. Then Eli sat down on the earthen floor and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders moved in the way that meant he was crying from the pain in his hands, from the release of effort held past its limit, from something that did not have a clean name at 8 years old. Willa sat beside him on the dirt and put her arm around him and let him finish without rushing him, because he had pulled that trunk with everything he had for 4 attempts and earned the right to whatever came after. Then she stood up and went back to work because the rafters were still waiting. 15 cottonwood poles, each 12 feet long, each cut from the creek bed in the days that followed, dragged back behind Kate 2 or 3 at a time, notched at the upper end to seat against the ridgepole, spaced 18 inches apart along the 20-foot length of the structure. Each one was a day's work broken into stages. Each one made the frame more real, a thing that existed in the actual world, rather than only in the necessity that had generated it. By the time the rafter frame was complete, the first week of September had been consumed entirely. The brush layer went on next, dried grass, dead branches from along the creek, anything flat enough to create a surface for the sod above it. Bertie came twice that week, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who has negotiated a long-standing agreement with her own body and knows exactly what that agreement includes. She laid brush in silence, and when her back signaled the end of its portion, she went home without ceremony, which Willa had come to understand was its own form of respect. Cutting sod with the breaking plow produced long ribbons of prairie ripped free at the root. Dense, dark smelling of the accumulated centuries of things that had grown and died and become the ground itself. Each slab was heavy in the way of a thing that has never been asked to move before. Willa loaded them onto a sledge, dragged them to the ruin, carried them up the ladder one at a time, grass side down onto the brush, fitting them together with the same logic as stones in a wall, edges tight, no gaps large enough to matter. The September sun was still summer sun for the first 2 weeks, and it had opinions about the back of her neck that she acknowledged and ignored. She worked from first light until working was no longer possible every day that was not raining, and on 2 days that were because October did not care about her preference for dry conditions. The frost arrived on the morning of September 14th, 2 days ahead of the schedule Otto Frick had given her. She woke to find ice crystals on the brush layer visible through the open section of the roof, sparkling in the first light like something that did not understand it was a warning. She had perhaps 160 square feet of sod still to lay. 2 weeks of work remaining. She had perhaps 10 days before hard cold became a real possibility rather than a theoretical one. She went back to work before the frost had time to fully melt. At the end of that day, with the light going and her arms past the point of reliable function, she became aware that Otto Frick was standing at the north fence line. He was not moving. He was watching the roof take shape in the evening light, the sod layer that now covered more than half the frame. The brush visible in the sections not yet covered the ridgepole connecting the two end walls like a spine. He stood there for a long time. He did not call out. He did not come closer. He was still there when the light finally failed, and she could no longer see him. It was in the last days of September that Bertie fell. She had been climbing the ladder to pass sod slabs up to Willa, not a task her body was designed for in the 7th decade of her life, but a task she had been doing anyway because her body's limitations had never been a particularly convincing argument for not doing what needed doing. The ladder shifted on the uneven ground. Her foot lost the rung. She came down on her left side, striking the packed earth with the impact of a woman whose frame has enough mass to cause real damage when it meets the ground at speed. She was not broken. Nothing cracked, nothing displaced beyond what bruising could account for. But she was grounded for 4 days, and in those 4 days, Willa laid the remaining sod alone, one slab at a time, up the ladder, and down and up again until the last piece seated into the gap at the northwest corner on the 7th of October as the afternoon light went gold and began its early withdrawal from the sky. She stood in the center of the completed room and looked up at the earthen ceiling above her. 3 tons of prairie pressing down on charred cottonwood rafters on 2-foot limestone walls. She put her hand on the limestone and felt the stone hold itself, the way stone holds itself without drama, without visible effort, as a simple expression of what it was. The weight above did not move. The walls did not shift. The structure existed in the actual world, not only in the space between what she needed and what she had. Eli stood beside her, looking up at the sod ceiling with the expression of a child whose skepticism has been overtaken by evidence. Is it done? The roof is done. Her hand was still on the stone. We still need a stove. We still need fuel and food before the hard cold comes. But the roof is done. June had her piece of china in both hands, turning it in the last light that came through the low doorway. The blue flowers caught the late afternoon in the way that blue does, holding more light than seemed mathematically fair. Otto Frick came that evening as the temperature dropped with the decisiveness of a season that has made up its mind. He walked the perimeter of the structure the way he had walked it in August, slow, thorough, pressing his palm against the limestone in 2 places, studying where the sod met the top of the walls, examining the slight pitch she had built into the roof surface for drainage. He spent a long time at the northeast corner, where the fit between the sod edge and the wall face was tightest. He said nothing for a long while. The silence between them had changed in quality from August to October, without either of them explicitly acknowledging the change. It might hold. He said it the way a man says something he is still in the process of deciding, leaving the verdict a little open. Then, the roof isn't the problem anymore. The problem is what's inside. No stove, not enough fuel, not enough food stores to reach April. He paused. I still think the odds are against you, Mrs. Dane. But you've done something here that I didn't expect to see done. He turned to go, stopped without turning back. There's a box stove behind the Aldrich barn. Broken firebox cracked along the base of the combustion chamber. I looked at it 2 years ago. Decided it wasn't worth salvaging. Another pause shorter. Iron cement would seal it, if you could find any. He walked back toward his property. The evening cold came in behind him through the doorway. Willa looked at her children. June was asleep against the south wall, already her fragment of china still in her hand, the blue flowers facing up toward the earthen ceiling. Eli was watching his mother with the gray-green eyes that were his father's contribution to his face, waiting without asking, because he had learned the difference between moments that required a question and moments that required patience. She picked up her coat from the nail she had driven into the mortar between two stones. She went out into the October dark toward the Aldrich barn because finding the stove was the first step, and the first step was the only one currently available to her. The stove was there, cast iron rusted at every joint with a crack along the base of the firebox running the full length of her hand. The crack was not fresh, it had happened before the fire, and the fire had not improved the iron around it. She chipped the rust scale from the edges with a flat stone, pressed her thumbnail into the gap. Not through the wall. The iron on either side was solid. The stove was damaged, but not beyond what iron cement was designed to address if she could get iron cement, which cost $2 a can at the general store on Harwick's Main Street, and she had no dollars. She sat in the rubble of the Aldrich barn and held this fact in her hands along with everything else she was holding, which was considerable. Then she stood up because sitting in rubble was not a plan and walked 2 miles east in the October dark to Bertie Voss's door. Bertie answered with a lamp. She looked at Willa standing on the porch without comment on the hour or the darkness and moved aside to let her in. They found the iron cement in the back of the barn behind a barrel of rusted nails. 2 cans, labels faded to near illegibility, but the contents still sealed, purchased by Clement Voss sometime before 1880 for a purpose that had apparently never arisen. Bertie pressed both cans into Willa's hands without preamble. Willa told her she couldn't take them without trade. Then trade, Bertie said. My barn roof has been leaking since Clement died. Come spring, you fix it. We're square. The dark eyes were steady. If you make it to spring, which is the relevant condition. Willa looked at the cans. 2 cans of iron cement and a broken stove and 4 walls that held temperature. What if I don't? Bertie Voss looked at her the way a 70-year-old woman looks at a 38-year-old one when she has outlived enough certainties to find false comfort insulting. Then I'll fix it myself and think poorly of your ghost for the inconvenience. Go fix your stove, Willa Dane. You're burning hours you don't have standing on my porch. Willa walked back through the October dark with 2 cans of iron cement and the specific weight of everything still ahead of her, and the stars above the Nebraska plains were cold and exact and did not offer opinions about any of it. The stove weighed 140 pounds and had developed strong views about remaining where it was. Willa mixed the iron cement to the consistency the faded label specified, packed it into the firebox crack with a piece of scrap iron she had shaped into something like a blade, smoothed it flush with the surrounding metal, and left it to cure for 24 hours, while the October air cooperated with the chemistry in a way that was one of the few things that fall that had cooperated without requiring persuasion. Moving the stove from the barn to the house walls required the same arithmetic as everything else that season. Her arms, Eli's arms, a sledge built from 2 planks and a length of chain, the slow, terrible progress of necessary work performed by people who are not quite sufficient for it, but are all that is available. The stove scraped a raw trail through the dirt. Eli pulled from the front with his full weight behind the rope. Willa pushed from behind with her hands flat against the cold iron, finding whatever the ground offered in the way of purchase and using all of it. June carried the stovepipe sections in separate trips, her small legs covering the 100 yards between barn and house with the focused efficiency of a child who understands that the work is real. Installation took the rest of the day. She cut the flue hole through the sod roof with a pointed iron rod and a hand auger working through the brush layer and the packed earth above it, sizing the hole for the pipe with the care of someone who knows that a gap too large means cold air with a direct path to the interior. She fashioned flashing from a flattened tin can, shaped it cold around the pipe, with her bare hands crimped the edges until it seated against the sod surface without assistance. The stove went in on the 19th of October. She built the first fire at dusk, with Eli feeding small sticks into the firebox while she watched the repaired crack for any sign that iron cement was not equal to the task she had given it. A thread of smoke escaped one end of the repair for the first few minutes, then stopped as the cement expanded with the heat and filled the remaining space in the crack from inside. The firebox held. The stove drew cleanly through the pipe the October temperature outside, creating the differential that pulled combustion gases upward without resistance. Heat moved into the room in a way that was different from the fire itself. The fire was a point of warmth in a cold room. The heat was in the room, and then it was in the walls, and the walls were doing the things she had built them to do. She pressed her palm against the limestone and felt it change under her hand, not quickly, not dramatically the way stone does. Nothing quickly or dramatically, but with the patient inevitability of a process that has been waiting for the right conditions and has now found them. The rock was storing what the stove gave it. Later, when the fire burned low, it would give it back. Eli put his hand on the wall beside hers. "The wall is warm," he said in the voice of a child who has just discovered that something he was told was possible is actually true, which is a different discovery from being told it, in a different voice from the one that hears promises. Willa looked at her son's hand on the warm stone. She thought about telling him that this was what she had planned, that it was working the way she had said it would work, that the theory had become fact. Instead, she said, "That's what it's for." Because that was the simpler truth, and simpler truths were what the moment needed. November arrived with the pragmatic efficiency of a Nebraska season that does not announce itself. It simply appears one morning, and the quality of the light is different, and the temperature has crossed a line. It will not recross until April, and the work of staying alive has changed in character from difficult to something requiring a more serious vocabulary. She had accumulated 1¼ cords of cottonwood from the creek bed split with a borrowed axe, stacked under the south overhang of the sod roof where it had minimal protection from precipitation. 2 wagon loads of dried cattle dung gathered from the open range before the first snow made the range inaccessible. 40 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of dried beans, a small barrel of salt pork, a sack of potatoes she had calculated against the calendar and determined would last through January if rationed without sentiment. Otto Frick came on the 3rd of November with the November air coming off him, and the look of a man who has been doing arithmetic that does not resolve the way he would like. He counted the fuel pile, he looked at the food stores, he ran the numbers with the unsentimental efficiency of a man whose 13 Nebraska winters had given him a precise understanding of what survival required and what fell short of it. "Cord and a quarter of wood," he said. "Call it 3 months if you're careful and the cow chips help. Hard cold doesn't end before April." He looked at her. "You're short by 6 weeks minimum. What happens in February?" Willa looked at the fuel pile against the wall, the food arranged on the plank shelving. She looked at the sky, which had acquired the flat, pale quality of a sky that is organizing itself for something. "I'll find a way through it." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not a plan. It's a prayer dressed up in working clothes." Something shifted behind his eyes, not softness, but the thing that lives adjacent to softness in men who have built their self-understanding on never being soft. "I've said something like that to you before. I am aware of that." "You have," she said. He left without resolving the shortfall because there was no resolution to offer. The shortfall was real. The calendar was real. The arithmetic was what it was. The first snow came on the 18th of November, 6 inches overnight, drifting to 2 feet against the north wall by morning. Willa woke to a silence so complete it had physical presence, the specific quiet of a world that has muffled itself. Inside the shelter, with the stove banked to embers and the limestone walls releasing what they had stored through the previous day's burning, the temperature held at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to see breath, warm enough that fingers remained functional. The differential between inside and outside was nearly 40 degrees, and the 2-foot walls were responsible for the bulk of it. She fed the stove. She made cornmeal mush stretch thinner than she had been making it. She rationed the wood and supplemented it with cow chips that burned hot and fast and required more frequent tending. She did not let herself calculate too precisely how many mornings like this one the fuel pile could sustain, because precise calculation led to a number she needed to remain theoretical for as long as possible. December arrived and settled in with the permanent intention of a season that has claimed its territory. Temperatures dropped to 15 below on the 8th of December, 20 below on the 12th. The creek froze solid within a week of the first hard cold. The prairie disappeared under accumulating snow, 2 feet, then 3, and the distance between the shelter and Harwick's main street, 300 yards on a clear August morning, became a different kind of distance when the drifts ran thigh-deep across every path she had worn into the ground. She settled into a rhythm that was less a routine than a set of non-negotiable demands placed on her body at regular intervals through every night. The stove consumed wood and cow chips and twisted grass with a steady appetite that never varied regardless of what she had left to give it. She woke every 3 hours, fed the firebox, checked the children's breathing, not because she doubted they were breathing, but because the checking was the minimum action available to her at 3 in the morning when the wind was talking to the north wall and she needed to be doing something. Then she slept again until the cycle repeated. Eli started waking before she did. She would open her eyes in the cold dark and find him already at the woodpile selecting a piece by feel in the near darkness, easing it into the firebox without disturbing June. She watched him do this on the fourth night, in the fifth, in the sixth, and she said nothing about it because there was nothing to say that the watching did not already communicate between them. Nell Cutter appeared on the 15th of December without announcement, pushing through the low plank door, carrying a bundle of dried corn cobs under one arm. She stepped inside, set the bundle down, looked at the walls, looked at the sleeping children, looked at the stove with its steady amber light behind the mica window. "Corn cobs," she said. "More than I need. No use for cooking, but they'll catch and hold a flame well enough." She looked around the room with the expression of someone working through a private revision. The walls were warm, the children were sleeping. The stove was doing exactly what a stove was supposed to do. Outside, the December wind was conducting its usual argument with the plains. Inside, it was possible to be still. "I have seen soddies collapse in hard cold," she said, her voice quieter than her usual register. "I have seen frame houses crack their walls when the temperature dropped fast. I have never seen anything quite like what you've built here." She paused. "I'll be damned" was what she finally produced, which coming from Nell Cutter was approximately equivalent to a formal commendation. She left without a farewell, which was consistent with how she had arrived. The corn cobs burned for 3 days. Willa twisted the emptied husks into tight coils she had read about in a farming almanac, prairie fuel grass and plant fiber, compressed into a density that slowed combustion enough to matter at the margins. Her hands cracked at the knuckles from the combination of cold air dry conditions and the repetitive motion of twisting. She wrapped the cracks in strips cut from the hem of her spare dress and kept twisting because the fuel sticks added hours to what she had, and hours were the currency she was working in now. Christmas passed quietly. New Year's followed it into the record without celebration. January arrived as January arrives in Nebraska in the winter of 1887, not as a continuation of what came before it, but as a separate and more serious thing. A cold that was not merely the absence of warmth, but an active presence with its own character and its own timeline, and no particular interest in what the people on the surface of it needed. The sky went pewter on the 3rd of January and stayed there building something. On the morning of the 6th, the clouds that had been organizing in the northwest for 3 days reached the point where they had finished organizing. Snow began at noon light, at first the kind of flakes that fall without urgency, the kind a person might look at through a window and think, this is manageable. A slow curtain drawing across the middle distance. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind had located its intention. By 6, the world beyond the shelter's small south-facing window, a 6-inch square of salvaged glass that Willa had installed in October, had been replaced entirely by moving white. Not falling white. Moving white horizontal, driven by a wind from the northwest that had nothing between it and the shelter except 300 yards of open ground and 2 feet of limestone. The sod roof above absorbed the sound of the wind and returned the interior to something close to silence. The stove burned. The walls held what they had been given. Willa fed the stove every 2 hours instead of 3. She could feel the storm pulling temperature from the exterior surfaces of the structure, a slight cooling of the air near the north wall, a marginal drop in the room temperature that the walls were compensating for by releasing their stored heat at a higher rate than usual. She did not let the fire drop below the threshold she had established in her mind as the minimum. Below that minimum was a calculation she refused to complete. The thermometer outside the door, the one Frick had given her in October, framed as practical necessity, accepted as such, read -28 on the morning of the 7th, -31 on the 8th. The wind velocity had not diminished. The snow had not paused. The 9th of January was when she understood this was not a storm. In the conventional sense, a thing that builds toward a peak and then releases. This was a sustained condition, a geological fact visiting the surface of the Earth, and it would end when it decided to end and not before. The drifts against the north wall had buried the limestone to the top of the first course of stone. Snow forced itself under the door in a persistent drift. She scooped out each morning with a tin cup. The path to the fuel pile, 8 feet of packed down ground, had to be kept open by constant repetition, dug out each time she went for wood refilling, in the hour it took her to get back inside and return for the next load. She counted the remaining fuel on the morning of the 9th. 3/4 of a quart of wood, 1 full basket of cow chips, 11 bundles of twisted corn husks, enough hay fuel sticks to fill a wash basin. She pressed her shaking hands flat against the warm limestone wall until the shaking stopped, then counted again in case the first count had been wrong. It had not been wrong. 4 days of fuel remaining at current burn rate. The storm had already lasted 3 days. The temperature outside was 31 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the wind had not slowed. Eli watched her from across the room with his father's gray-green eyes and his father's particular quality of stillness, the look of a person who understands that some moments require patience rather than questions. He had been waking through the night with her for weeks now, feeding the fire in shifts, his 8-year-old hands steadier than she would have believed possible when she had carried him onto a westbound train the previous May. June sat against the south wall with her piece of china, the fragment of blue-flowered white she had carried since the first morning in the Aldrich ruin, turning it in her hands. She had been doing this more frequently in the past 2 days, examining it from different angles, as if the object contained information she had not yet extracted. The knock came at the threshold of the 10th. Not wind. She had catalogued every sound the wind made against every surface of this structure across 3 months of increasing seriousness, and she knew the inventory. This was rhythmic, deliberate, the sound of a human fist striking wood with the particular cadence of a person who is not certain they have enough strength remaining to keep doing it. Willa crossed the room and took the axe from beside the stove. Eli was already on his feet. She moved him gently back with one hand and opened the door with the other. Otto Frick stood on the threshold. He was covered in snow in the way of a man who has been moving through the storm long enough that the distinction between him and it has become unclear. His face, where skin was exposed above the beard, had gone the dangerous white of flesh that has lost the argument with temperature and is in the process of accepting the outcome. His eyes, when they found hers, carried the specific quality of a man who has spent everything he had on the act of arriving and has nothing remaining for what comes after. Behind him, barely visible through the moving white two shapes, Carl was 6 years old and he was carrying his sister, or attempting to. Marta's arm was around his neck, her feet dragging through the snow, and he was leaning into the wind with the absolute concentrated effort of a child who has been given one instruction and has decided that instruction is the whole of his existence. Marta's face was pressed against his shoulder, her lips visible for a moment as Willa pulled the door fully open, where the color that lips go when the blood has retreated from the surface to protect what is deeper. The roof collapsed. Frick's voice came out of him in pieces, forced through a passage that cold had narrowed. An hour ago, the snow had built on the north side, and then I couldn't reach Ingrid. She was with the cattle in the barn. She was trying to. I had the children I couldn't carry. He stopped. His weight shifted forward. Please. Willa pulled him inside. She reached past him for Carl, taking the boy by both arms, relieving him of his sister's weight. Marta was limp with the specific limpness of a body that has stopped making active decisions and is waiting for warmth to restore its authority. Her hands, when Willa stripped the frozen outer layers from them, were ivory from fingertip to wrist. She placed both children directly against the south wall. The warmest wall, the one that had been absorbing the stove's output all day from the closest position. She layered every blanket in the shelter over them. Eli moved his sleeping spot without being asked, pressing himself against Carl's back and adding whatever heat an 8-year-old body generates through the simple fact of being alive. June pressed herself against Marta's side, turned her face toward the smaller child's cold cheek, and stayed there without being told. Willa poured cornmeal mush into 2 tin cups thinner than she had been, making it stretch further, because there were now 6 people in a shelter provisioned for 3, and pressed the cups into the children's hands. They drank with the complete focus of children for whom the distinction between want and need has ceased to be meaningful. Frick had made it as far as the east wall. He was sitting against it with his hands extended toward the stove, trembling in the deep, involuntary way of a body reclaiming itself from cold that had nearly finished the claim. He was looking at the floor. "Where is Ingrid?" Willa asked it directly because leaving the question unasked would not make the answer different and would only delay the weight of it falling where it was going to fall. He did not look up. His hands trembled against his knees. He shook his head a small single motion. Willa understood. She went back to the stove. She did not ask anything more about Ingrid Frick. There was nothing to ask that the answer would improve. She spent the remainder of that evening making fuel sticks, twisting hay tighter than she had been twisting it, because tighter burned slower and slower was what the arithmetic required. Her knuckles had split at every joint. She wrapped them in cloth and kept twisting. The lamp burned low. She twisted in the near dark by feel her fingers working the motion they had memorized weeks ago, the pile growing beside her one stick at a time. The storm did not stop on the 10th. It did not stop on the 11th. On the morning of the 11th, Frick checked the thermometer by opening the door 3 inches and reading it in the pale gray light. He came back and said flatly without inflection, 46 below. At 46 degrees below zero, exposed skin freezes in under 4 minutes. A healthy adult without shelter dies in less than an hour. Cattle in a barn, even a standing barn with inadequate insulation against that kind of cold. Frick did not say this. He did not need to. He sat back against the east wall and looked at his children sleeping in the blanket pile, and his face did what faces do when a person stops trying to prevent what is happening inside them from being visible. Inside the stone shelter, the temperature held at 35 degrees. Not comfortable, not what anyone would choose. 1 degree above the line that ends things when things are measured by whether water freezes or does not. But the walls were doing what they had been built to do, absorbing the stove's output, releasing it slowly and steadily, compensating for the fire. When the fire burned low, maintaining the room's temperature through the thermal mass of 2 feet of Nebraska limestone that did not care what the weather outside was doing and was not going to be hurried into caring. Eli had taken over the hay twisting. His hands were steadier than Willa's by now, and the technique had become his twist-fold compress set aside. He worked without complaint, without asking when it would end, without any indication that these questions were occurring to him. They were occurring to him. He was 8 years old, and they were occurring to him constantly. He simply had made a decision about what to do with them. On the second night of 6 people in the shelter, the night of the 11th, after the children had finally surrendered to sleep, Frick spoke into the quiet between them. "How did you know it would work?" His voice was low, careful, a question that had been sitting in him for a long time, waiting for the right conditions. Willa was working through the last of the hay by lamplight. "I didn't." He looked at her. "Then, I had walls that held cold in summer." Her hands kept moving. "I knew that sod houses where warm settlers use them everywhere out here because the earth insulates. I had stone walls, and I had prairie, and I had children who needed to not freeze." She set aside one finished stick, started another. "I didn't know it would work, Mr. Frick. I had a theory and a necessity, and not enough time to wait for certainty." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled in the stove. The walls stood in their silence. "I built my house with 13 years of knowledge," he said. "Proper materials, proper methods, everything done the way it was supposed to be done. It lasted 4 days." He looked at the earthen ceiling, the charred rafters she had salvaged from the ruin next door. "You built this in 8 weeks with no experience from materials other people had abandoned. The walls were already here. Someone else built those. You put a roof on them, a roof that is holding 3 tons of snow while my properly built house is rubble." Something in his face shifted, a slow internal movement like ground settling. "My wife told me to help you. In August, she said that woman needs help or she won't last. I said she'd fail regardless. No point spending effort on a lost cause." His voice had gone to something past flat into the territory where tone has been removed because what the words contain is enough without it. "I was certain, Mrs. Dane. 11-13 winters. I knew how things worked. I knew what was possible. I knew—" He stopped, pressed his hands against his face. "I was wrong about everything that mattered." Willa looked at the man who had told her in August that she would die sitting in the shelter she had built. In the warmth, the walls were returning to them, while outside the temperature was 46 below and the world had been replaced by white. "You were wrong about me," she said. "You may not have been wrong about much else." He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly into his hands, "I should have made her come inside before the storm. She wanted to stay with the cattle. I let her stay." There was nothing to say to that. Willa twisted another haystick. The fire breathed. The children breathed. Outside, the wind ran its cold hands along the north wall and found no way through, and the limestone stood in its indifference to weather that it had been accumulating since long before any of them were born. On the morning of the 12th, the knocking came again. Different from Frick's knocking, weaker, or rhythmic, the sound of a fist that has lost reliable communication with the arm behind it. Willa took the axe. She opened the door. Nell Cutter fell across the threshold. She was not wearing a coat. She was not wearing gloves. She had left her house half a mile north wearing a house dress and a wool shawl. Neither garment designed for 46 degrees below zero. Neither garment offering more than the difference between dying in seconds and dying in minutes. And she had walked through hip-deep drifts, through wind that stripped exposed skin of its warmth in under 3 minutes, guided by the only thing visible in a world that had become featureless and white in every direction. The smoke from Willa's stovepipe. Even in the chaos of the blizzard, with the wind driving snow horizontally and visibility reduced to arm's length, smoke rises. It rises because heat rises, and smoke is what heat carries up with it. And Nell Cutter had walked toward that rising column through a Nebraska blizzard at 46 below zero because it was the only direction that led toward anything other than the cold. She had made it because the distance was half a mile rather than a mile. She had made it because she had started before her hands stopped working. She had made it by some margin that was not generous enough to examine closely. Fire. Her lips were cracked to bleeding, her face modeled in the specific pattern of skin announcing that it is losing the argument with extreme cold, her voice reduced to something that required the room's full silence to hear. "My house, the stove, I overloaded it. The flue caught the whole—" She stopped. Something moved through her that resolved into a sound she did not intend, something between a cough and the laugh of a person encountering an absurdity too large for conventional response. "My house is burning, right now, out there in the blizzard, burning." Willa pulled her inside, stripped the frozen shawl away, pressed her against the south wall, the warm wall where 2 children were already sleeping, and the limestone was giving back everything the stove had given it. She poured the last of the warm water into a cup, barely warm. The pot had been off the heat for an hour, and put it in Nell's shaking hands. "Drink this slowly," she said. Nell drank. Water sloshed over the rim because her hands were not yet reliable, but she drank what stayed in the cup, and she looked at Willa over the rim with eyes that were working through something large and private. "That ridiculous roof," Nell said finally when her voice had enough warmth behind it to carry. "That ridiculous sod roof that I told you would collapse and bury your children." She looked up at the earthen ceiling, the charred rafters. "You were right. You were right about all of it. 7 people, 320 square feet. A fuel supply that had been marginal for 3 and was now something the arithmetic could not resolve in their favor." Willa looked at the remaining wood, the last basket of cow chips, the dwindling pile of fuel sticks. She looked at the children sleeping in their layered blankets. She looked at the walls she had built the roof from, the walls she had built, the argument from the walls that had been standing since before the Aldrich fire and would likely be standing after everyone in this room was gone. Then June said from somewhere in the blanket pile, in the clear, unhurried voice of a child who has been thinking about something and has arrived at a conclusion, "Mama." Willa turned. June was sitting up, holding her piece of china in both hands, the blue flowers catching the lamplight. "You told me once that people burn their furniture when they run out of coal. You said grandmother's neighbors burned their chairs one winter when the coal didn't come." She looked at her mother with the focused calm of a 5-year-old who believes she has solved the problem and is waiting for confirmation. "Can we burn the ladder?" The room was quiet. Frick looked at the ladder leaning against the south wall, the ladder Willa had built to lay the sod roof, 8 feet of joined salvaged lumber dry, as the September day she had put it together. He looked at the doorframe. He looked at the plank shelving along the east wall, the scrap lumber stacked in the north corner against unspecified future need. All of it wood, all of it dry, all of it burnable. The ladder was 12 hours of fuel. The remaining doorframe was another 8. The shelving was 4 or 5. The scrap lumber in the corner was perhaps 6 more. Willa crossed to the ladder. She picked up the axe. She took the ladder apart in under 15 minutes, working the joints she had made. Well, working them apart anyway, because a well-constructed thing that needs to become heat is still capable of becoming heat given sufficient reason. The wood separated into sections that fit the firebox. The stove accepted them with the same patient appetite it had shown for everything she had given it since October. The room temperature rose, 37 degrees. Frick stood without speaking and extended his hand toward the axe. Not asking, just standing with his hand extended the way a man stands when he has finished deliberating and has arrived at the only available action. Willa handed it to him. He took the door frame apart with the efficiency of a man who has stopped managing his relationship to the situation and is simply managing the situation. She directed him to the shelving next, then to the scrap lumber, each piece assessed for burn rate, and added to the pile beside the stove in the order that would serve them best. 7 people, 37 degrees inside the walls, 46 below outside them. Fuel for perhaps 2 more days. The storm continued through the 12th into the 13th, through the long dark hours of the 13th into the 14th. The wind ran its cold argument along the exterior walls of the shelter and found the same answer it had been finding since January 6th: stone, 2 feet of it indifferent to everything the weather brought to the conversation. Willa twisted the last of the hay into fuel sticks. She burned the twisted hay. She burned the remaining cow chips. She burned every piece of wood remaining that was not structural, calculating each piece against the hours remaining before whatever came next. On the 14th, she counted what she had left. Half a cord of wood. Nothing else. Frick ran the same numbers. 1 more day, he said. Maybe 2 if we drop the fire further. Then we drop the fire further, Willa said. She dropped it. The walls compensated. The temperature inside fell to 32 degrees, the precise threshold, the edge, and held there because the limestone was releasing everything it had been given every hour of burning since October. Every degree of heat she had fed into these walls, and the walls were giving it back now in the hour of maximum need, and 32 degrees was survival, and survival was what she had built this for. On the morning of the 15th of January, 1887, Willa opened her eyes in the dark and noticed something wrong. The absence of sound. The wind had been a constant for 9 days. 9 days of the same roaring presence against the north wall, the same howling through whatever gaps it could locate, the same white noise of sustained violence against every surface the structure presented. She had stopped hearing it as a separate thing days ago. It had become the baseline, the condition beneath everything else. Now the baseline was gone. She sat up. The fire was low embers. The room temperature was 32 degrees. 7 people breathing in the darkness of a stone room under a sod roof, under the silence of a stopped storm. She wrapped herself in what remained of the blankets and moved to the door. She pushed it open. The sky above Harwick, Nebraska on the morning of January 15, 1887, was a blue so deep and clear and cold, it looked like something that had been held back for weeks and was now overdue. The sun was coming up in the east with the low, long light of a winter morning, throwing shadows across a transformed world. The drifts were mountainous, 15 feet in places, sculpted by 9 days of wind into shapes that had no referent in the ordinary world. Frozen waves, frozen walls, frozen architecture, built and inhabited by nothing. The path to the Frick property was gone, replaced by a continuous field of white that showed no evidence anything had ever stood there. In the direction of Harwick's main street, the buildings were visible only as dark interruptions in the drift line at the level of their eaves. The temperature was 22 degrees below zero, still lethal in exposure, still capable of killing in minutes the wrong circumstances. But the wind had stopped, the snow had stopped, the sky was the blue of a thing that has finished and does not intend to resume. Willa stood in the doorway without her coat and breathed the air of a stopped storm. Behind her movement, Frick appeared at her shoulder, looked out at the white world that had replaced the world he had known. He looked for a long time in the direction of his property, where the only evidence of what had stood there was the slight depression in the drift that marked where a building had altered the wind pattern before it collapsed. "It's over," he said. Willa shook her head. "It stopped. That's not the same thing." She was right, and he knew it, and the knowing of it was in his face. The cold would continue for weeks. The drifts would take months to melt. The work of survival, finding food, finding fuel, accounting for what had been lost, and what needed to be built again was not finished. It was entering a new phase. The emergency was over, and the aftermath was beginning, and aftermaths require their own kind of endurance. But 7 people walked out of a stone shelter on the morning of January 15th into 22 below air, their breath rising in white columns in the crystalline light, and all of them were alive. The town emerged from the snow over the following days. 19 people had died in the storm, 13 from cold, 4 from collapsed structures, 2 from fires that spread when overloaded stoves were abandoned in the panic of structural failure. Of the 23 families in and around Harwick, 17 had survived in their own homes. 3 had found shelter with neighbors. 3 had lost everything. Ingrid Frick was found on January 17th, 120 yards from the collapsed walls of the Frick house. She had been moving away from the house in the direction of the barn when the cold stopped her. She was found in a posture that suggested she had not fallen, but had simply stopped the cold completing its work before her body had time to respond to what was happening. She was 20 yards from the barn door. They buried her on January 20th in ground that required 2 days of work to open to sufficient depth. Otto Frick stood at the grave with Carl's hand in his right hand and Marta's in his left. And he did not speak, and Willa stood behind them with her own children, and did not speak either because there were not words adequate to what they were all standing in the presence of. And she had learned enough by January to know that inadequate words are worse than silence. Raymond Holt did not attend. He had left for Omaha before the storm, having assessed the incoming weather with the same calculating eye he brought to property values, and would not return to Harwick until June, by which time the Aldrich ruin, the pile of rocks he had offered $9 for, had become the most discussed structure in Custer County. The validation came the way important things tend to come slowly, and then with a completeness that made the slowness seem strange in retrospect. Frick came to Willa on the 20th of January, 5 days after the storm broke, carrying a bundle of firewood he had found in the wreckage of a neighbor's outbuilding that had collapsed but not burned. He stood in the doorway with it and did not seem to know exactly how to begin, which was unusual for a man who had always known precisely how to begin. "I owe you an apology," he said. Willa was repairing a tear in Eli's coat, the needle moving with the mechanical steadiness of hands that had been doing repetitive work for months. She did not look up immediately. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Frick. I told you that you would die. I told you the shelter wouldn't work. I told you—" He stopped, started differently. "I was trying to protect myself from having to watch you fail. That's different from trying to protect you. I understand that now." She set down the coat. She looked at him standing in the doorway with the firewood, in the particular stiffness of a man delivering an accounting of himself that he has been working toward for some time. "You were wrong about me," she said. "You may not have been wrong about much else. I was wrong about what mattered." He set the firewood down. He looked at the walls, the earthen ceiling, the patched stove still radiating its steady warmth. "This thing you built. 13 winters in Nebraska, and I never thought to do what you did. Never thought to put stone and sod together this way." He shook his head slowly. "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" "People did," Willa said. "Stone buildings have existed for thousands of years. Sod roofs have existed for centuries. I didn't invent anything. I combined 2 things that already existed because I had the walls and I had the prairie, and I didn't have any other options." "You saw something," he said. "Something the rest of us didn't." Willa picked up Eli's coat again. "I saw that I couldn't afford to wait for the right way when the necessary way was available." She put the needle through the cloth. "That's not vision. That's arithmetic." Frick was quiet for a moment. "Then I want to rebuild. Not a frame house. Not a soddy. Stone walls, sod roof, the way you built this." He looked at her. "Will you show me how?" The man who had told her in August that she would die, who had stood at his fence line and watched her build this thing without offering his hands, who had sent his wife into a storm that killed her, rather than coming across 300 yards of ground to offer what he knew, standing in her doorway, asking for her help. Asking to learn what she had taught herself. "Yes," Willa said. "I'll show you." Nell Cutter came the following day, her face still carrying the mottled marks of the frostbite that had mapped itself onto her skin during her half-mile walk through the storm. She walked without the coat she had lost to the fire, wearing a borrowed one that did not fit her properly, and she stood inside the shelter and looked around it, with the assessing gaze of a woman who has just lost everything she owned and is now looking at the thing that kept her alive. "I'm going to rebuild," she said without preamble, which was her consistent mode. "My husband built that frame house before I married him. I always thought it was cold. I always thought it let the wind in. I was right about that, as it turns out." She studied the walls, the roof, the way the structure fit together. Stone walls and sod roof. How much does it cost? Willa thought about the question with the care it deserved. $5 for the ruin in my case. Nothing for the limestone, it's in the ground everywhere around here, a foot below the surface. Nothing for the sod, the prairie is the sod. The stove cost labor rather than money. The iron cement was a trade. She paused. "The expensive part is the time. It took me 8 weeks. 8 weeks, Nell said. She was calculating something. 8 weeks to build a shelter that kept 7 people alive through 9 days of the worst storm in memory at temperatures that killed 19 people with conventional houses." She looked at Willa directly, which was how Nell Cutter looked at everything. "You know what this means?" "It means it worked. It means other people need to know how to do it." Nell's voice had the quality of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is now interested only in implementation. "Will you teach me not just the roof, all of it? The walls, the quarrying, the way you fitted the sod to the stone?" Willa set down what she was working on. She looked at Nell Cutter, difficult, honest, impractical, about almost nothing alive, because a 6-inch square of salvaged glass had let smoke from a salvaged stovepipe be visible through a sod roof during a blizzard that had replaced the world with white. "I'll teach you," she said. "Come spring when the ground thaws." Nell nodded once. "Come spring." She turned to leave, then paused. "You never told Frick he was wrong. When he came to apologize. You could have." Willa picked up her mending. "He knew he was wrong. He didn't need me to confirm it." Nell looked at her for a moment. Then she went out into the January cold, her borrowed coat flapping at her ankles, walking back toward the lot where her house had been, and where she was already, Willa suspected, beginning to think about what would replace it. The word spread in the way that genuinely useful knowledge spreads first to the people closest to the source, then outward in widening circles as each person who learned it taught it to the next person who needed it. The German farming families in the county already understood stone construction and were receptive to the modification that Willa's shelter demonstrated. Settlers in the neighboring counties sent representatives to examine the structure, to ask questions about dimensions and ratios and the specific technique for seating sod on top of brush, on top of charred rafters. A mason in the county seat began offering to build what he called hybrid shelters, stone walls, sod roofs for settlers who could afford to pay for labor rather than contribute it themselves. By March, Willa had explained her methods to 14 different families. By April 5, new structures were under construction within 20 miles of Harwick, each one adapting the basic principle to its own site and its own available materials. By summer, the approach had been adopted broadly enough that it was no longer a novelty, but simply another way of building one of several options now, rather than the eccentric obsession of a widow who had bought a ruin for $5. Willa shared everything she knew freely, without reservation, without compensation. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick. She walked farmers through the process of quarrying limestone from the shallow deposits that underlaid most of the county. She demonstrated sod cutting technique, brush laying the specific pitch of the roof that shed water rather than absorbing it. She answered every question she was asked, and she asked for nothing in return because the information was not something she had invented. She had assembled it from things that already existed, from principles that had been operating since long before she arrived in Nebraska. And assembled things did not belong to the person who assembled them, any more than a sentence belonged to the person who arranged the words. Martha Lindstrom said once in a conversation that Willa only heard about afterward, that Willa Dane had saved more lives by teaching than by building, which was true in the way that multiplied results are always true. The shelter saved 7 people in January of 1887, and what she taught those 14 families potentially reached further than any one building could reach. Willa, when this was repeated to her, said that she had not taught anything that was not already implicit in the materials available to anyone who looked at them carefully enough. Otto Frick rebuilt in the spring of 1887. He quarried his own limestone from the deposit that ran below the north pasture of his claim, shaped the blocks with hand tools, laid them with a mortar. He mixed himself from materials he ordered through the general store. The walls went up over 6 weeks slower than Willa's walls had gone up because Willa's walls had already been standing and he was building from the ground. He cut sod from his own land for the roof, selected cottonwood from the creek bed for the ridge pole, and rafters packed the brush layer himself on a Saturday afternoon, with Carl working beside him, the boy carrying brush from the pile to the roof frame, with the focused seriousness of a child who has recently learned that buildings matter. When the structure was complete, Frick walked through every county family he knew and told them what he had built and why and where the instruction had come from. He told the story plainly without editing the part where he had been wrong. He told them what he had said to Willa Dane in August of 1886, and what she had done after he said it, and what happened to his own house in January of 1887, and what would have happened to his children without the shelter she had built from a $5 ruin in 8 weeks of work. He told it this way every time with no softening of his own role in the story, because he had decided that the only honest use of having been wrong in a way that had consequences was to be as specific as possible about it when the telling might help someone avoid the same error. Each time someone asked where he had learned to build this way, he pointed in the direction of the Aldrich walls. "From that woman," he said, "the one I told would not survive to see Christmas." The bam. Nell Cutter built her new house the following summer, the second summer after the storm, taking longer than Frick because she was doing it primarily herself, and her back required a frank conversation with her ambitions about how much could be accomplished in a day. She laid stone in the morning when the air was cool and her joints had not yet registered the day's full complaint. She cut sod in the afternoon when the sun had warmed the ground. She built the roof over 3 weeks in September, setting sod bricks one at a time, climbing her own ladder, making the same journey up and down that Willa had made the previous September, with the same stakes and the same absence of assistance, and the same result. A roof that held that seal that transformed a rectangle of stone walls into a place where winter could not reach unless invited. The barn roof she had promised Bertie in exchange for the iron cement Willa had taken for the stove. Willa fixed it in May of 1887, the first spring. She spent 3 days on Bertie's barn, replacing the worst of the rotted sheathing, repacking the gaps, securing the ridge cap that had been the source of the primary leak. Bertie watched from the ground and offered no commentary on the quality of the work, which Willa took as the equivalent of a formal approval. Bertie Voss lived until the spring of 1892, when she died in her Vermont and Nebraska way, quietly in her chair, having outlasted her husband by 6 years, and most of the assumptions people had made about what a woman of 70 could accomplish on the Nebraska plains. Willa was with her at the end, having made the 2-mile walk east when Bertie's neighbor sent word, and she sat beside the old woman in the early morning while the light came in through the window. Bertie's husband had installed in 1873, and she held the hand that had helped her set sod bricks in October of 1886 when nobody else was available to help. There was nothing to say that the hand-holding did not say more precisely. Raymond Holt returned to Harwick in June of 1887, arriving in the same polished buggy, wearing a suit that had not been slept in, with the same calculated affability that he brought to all his professional interactions. He found Willa in her garden, a small plot behind the south wall of the shelter, where she was growing what the soil and the season allowed, and he stood at the garden's edge with the slightly adjusted bearing of a man who has returned to a situation he expected to find resolved in one direction and has found it resolved in another. He told her he understood the property had acquired some additional value since the winter. He was prepared to offer $50, 10 times what she had paid, a number he appeared to feel was generous. Willa was kneeling over a row of beans. She stayed kneeling. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression was the same one she had brought to every interaction with Raymond Holt. Patient, clear-eyed, unimpressed by the performance. "Get off my land, Mr. Holt." He opened his mouth. "Whatever you're about to say, I've heard the version that ends with me accepting an offer I don't want. I've heard it twice now. The answer is still no, the property is still not for sale, and the calculation you're running in your head about what I need is still wrong." She went back to her beans. "Go find something else to speculate on." Holt stood at the garden's edge for a moment longer, recalculating. Then he turned and walked back to his buggy and drove out of Harwick, and he did not come back, which was the best possible outcome of all the possible outcomes available to him. In the late summer of 1887, in the season that was exactly 1 year from the season, when Willa Dane had set $5 silver on Alderman's counter and asked if that was enough, the knowledge she had assembled from necessity and limestone and prairie grass and charred wood had spread beyond what she could track. Families she had never met were building walls she had never visited. Methods she had developed from desperation had become in some parts of the county simply the way things were done, no longer associated with her name, no longer a story, just technique. She thought about this sometimes without much emotion in either direction. She had not invented anything. She had assembled what was available into what was needed. That the assembly had been useful to people beyond herself was good the way that most good things are good, without drama, without the fanfare that stories require, but that actual good things rarely produce. She was 39 years old in the summer of 1887. She would live in the stone shelter for 34 more years. Eli grew up and built his own house 200 yards north of his mother's walls. Stone walls, sod roof, the same principle adapted to the dimensions his own family required. He was married at 23 to a woman from Lincoln who had read about the blizzard of 1887 in a newspaper account and found the shelter's story interesting, which was how she came to be in Harwick at all, which was how she came to meet Eli Dane, which was one of those chains of consequence that nobody plans and everyone involved eventually accepts as inevitable. June became a teacher. She taught at the Harwick schoolhouse for 28 years, first the elementary grades, and later as the school grew the older students who were preparing to leave Harwick for universities in Lincoln or Omaha or points further east. She kept her fragment of china on her desk for all 28 years, the blue flowers on the white ground, the piece she had carried since the first morning in the Aldrich ruin. Students asked about it. She told them it was a piece of a plate from a house that had burned down and that someone had kept it because it was still beautiful, and that being broken did not mean being finished. This was the lesson she most wanted them to take from the story, though she never framed it as a lesson. She just told them about the china. Willa Dane died on the 15th of March, 1921. She was 71 years old. She was found by Eli, who had come over that morning for his regular visit, and found her in the chair he had built for her 40th birthday. A simple thing, straight-backed, made from cottonwood, built to last facing the stove that had been patched with iron cement in October of 1886 and had never been replaced. The fire had burned down to embers sometime before dawn. The stone walls of the shelter were warm. They were warm because the limestone had spent the night releasing the heat the fire had given it during the previous day, which was what limestone does, absorbs and releases stores, and returns without any particular interest in being acknowledged for it. The walls had been doing this every day and night since October of 1886, through 34 winters, through the springs and summers and falls that bracketed those winters, through every kind of Nebraska weather that the subsequent decades had produced. They would go on doing it for some years after. Alderman, the land office clerk, lived until 1914 and told the story of the 5 silver dollars to anyone who would listen from about 1890 onward, which was when the story had accumulated enough distance to be told properly. He told it the way people tell stories about the moments they got something right when they easily could have gotten it wrong, with a particular emphasis on his own hesitation, his own doubt, the weight of the coins on his counter, and the look in her eyes when she asked if $5 was enough. He told it as a story about a decision he had made that he was proud of, which it was, though he knew as well as anyone that the decision had been easy compared to what came after it. The stone walls of the Aldrich ruin, Willa Dane's shelter, the structure that had housed 7 people through the blizzard of 1887, stood for more than a century after her death. The sod roof required replacement several times over the decades and eventually was left open to the sky when the last generation of the Dane family moved to Lincoln in the 1960s, and the land passed through several sets of hands, none of whom had use for the structure. The walls remained. 2 feet of Custer County limestone blackened at the top, where the Aldrich fire had burned in 1884, standing in the high grass at the western edge of what was once the town of Harwick, Nebraska. If you know where to look, they are still there. 4 walls and open sky above them, the same configuration that existed when a woman with $5 and 2 children, and no experience of building anything larger than a chicken coop, walked through the doorless opening in August of 1886, and turned slowly in the center, measuring what she had with her eyes, trying to understand what could be made of it. The stone held cold in summer and heat in winter, and the memory of both in the long Nebraska seasons between. That was what it was built for. That was what it did.